Hello, welcome. We are now at week 8 of the CIL eAcademy, and the topic for this week is climate change and international law. I hope you have enjoyed the lecture yesterday with Professor Christina Voigt, and she will be back tomorrow with you. But today we are very happy to have with us a guest lecturer that will speak to you on the topic of climate change and human rights. Professor Geraldine Giraudeau, a warm welcome from the CIL eAcademy on behalf of myself and Professor Niloufer Oral, who's the director of the Center for International Law and also co-director of the CIL eAcademy. We are extremely happy that you were able to accept our invitation to speak to our students today on this very important topic, and on which, of course, I also have a personal interest, since I've also been working on it in the context of the International Law Commission, the issue of climate change and human rights. Let me just introduce briefly Professor Geraldine Giraudeau from France, who is a professor of international law at the University of Paris-Saclay, and an associate member of the larger University of New Caledonia, where she spent some time until recently. She holds a PhD from the University of Paris 1, Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, and the University of Carlos III in Madrid. She has served as an assessor judge appointed by UNHCR to the French National Court of Asylum from 2012 to 2016. And she was also a visiting professor at the University of Waikato, New Zealand. She's currently, and that's also in interest because I know there are some colleagues in CIL that are also part of this ILA committee on cables and pipelines. Our very dear Professor Tara Davenport, who's been lecturing also on law of the sea issues. So Professor Geraldine Giraudeau is also a member of that committee. And she's secretary of the Scientific Committee of the Natural Park of the Coral Sea. Her research has been focusing on general international law, mainly on territorial issues, law of the sea, human rights, and migrations. And one of the reasons we've invited Professor Giraudeau today is because she's been involved in the production of a documentary that we have asked kindly participants to watch, a documentary called Nations of Water, which is available in YouTube, and we will also share with the wider audience the link to that documentary, which is freely available on YouTube, and it's a very interesting documentary. I've watched it already a few times and also share it with some other students on the legal issues that arise in the Pacific Islands concerning sea level rise and its impact on the affected population and the issues of loss of territory and maritime zones. So Professor Geraldine Giraudeau, dear Geraldine, it's really a great pleasure to have you, and we will hear from you in an initial moment, and then we will have time at the end for a discussion with the participants, which I'm sure will be also looking forward to ask you questions. So Professor Giraudeau, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I would like first to thank you and Niloufer very warmly for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be able to participate to the CIL Academy, and it's also a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss a little bit on the documentary Nations of Water, because as you can imagine, it's been quite a long work, and the best reward is to be able to share some reflections on that with the students and practitioners and others academics. So today my purpose would not be so much about giving a classical academic lecture, but more to share some insights and to give the basis for our discussion on the film, and more largely to think about the evolution of the right of the climate change law from the perspective of human rights and its evolution. So for that, I will speak a little bit about the making of the film Nations of Water, how the project came out, and because I think maybe some of the difficulties we had to face says also something about the context of human rights and climate change in the Pacific. And I will also comment the points, the aspects we wanted to underline in the film, and also I will also make some comments on what's not in the film and why. And I will finally conclude with some general comments on the evolution of climate change and human rights, and more precisely on climate migrations. So regarding the making of Nations of Water and how the project was born, so obviously I'm not the only one who made this documentary possible, far from that, because the direction was also due to Aline Englum, who's a researcher in New York and who brought fantastic images from the Pacific in her project called Vanishing Places. And also the editing of the documentary was made by Valérie Batty, who's working at the University of New Caledonia. And it is also due to the collaboration and the participation of all the contributors, and I feel really grateful for them to have to hold for all these colleagues and young leaders to have participated in the project. So the idea of Nations of Water was born a few years ago when the PURN, which is the Pacific network of universities and for research in the Pacific, proposed some funding for a project on climate migrations, which is, as you know, an issue Pacific states and territories are very concerned of. And since a long time, as climate crisis is above all a human rights crisis, and that effects of climate change in the region are considered to be the main threat for Pacific islands and countries. And this is for them also, we're going to talk about this further, but this is also a survival issue for them. So at that time, we were at the end of 2018, 2019. Lots of very interesting academic research had already been conducted on climate migration. I was at that time teaching at the University of New Caledonia at Nouméa. And I thought that maybe what we needed was not so much to organize a new conference or a new publication, but maybe to create something that could be a new support, a new another kind of basis to be able to create links between scholars, because it happens in other topics, but particularly in the Pacific, it's quite frequent that French-speaking academics and English-speaking academics are working on the same field, and they're not necessarily tightly connected. And I thought that was also a way to give some context, to contextualize the reflections we could have on law and climate-induced migration, and more widely human rights and climate change, because we know the power of images and how they can help support learning and reflections. And also, more generally, my belief is that contextualization of legal teaching and research is a key aspect to be able to make links with practice, not only state practice, but also all the stakeholders' practice. So the idea was to show what is at stake when we talk about relocation for people, that it is always a very last resort measure, and that we need, in the meantime, recognition of states' duties to take all measures allowing people not to move. But at the same time, the governments need to be conscious of what's going ahead and be prepared for that. And that is what law is about, finally, about anticipation. It was also, the idea was also to show that even if the Pacific Islands and countries are at the front line of the effects of climate change, there is also a diversity of situations, and they do not all face exactly the same risks or the same level of risk. Also, because I was spending that time in Melanesia, I could notice from very close how culture, so in New Caledonia, Kanak culture was tightly linked to land. When I was reading academic literature, I found very interesting reflections on legal framework of legal climate-induced migration, but maybe not so much about how rights, about how populations and communities would be affected by these relocations, and also not so much about the rights of these communities to stay on their lands. And finally, maybe the last aspect of the project, when we thought about it with Valerie in Nouméa, was also to underline the scientific interest there was in focusing on the Pacific, because it can sound weird when we talk about legal thinking to focus on an area, on some parts of the world. But Pacific Islands constitute a unique environment for many reasons, actually. But their singularity lies in their situation, or one of their singularities lies in their situation towards the effects of climate change. They are at the front line of these effects of different aspects. Sea level rise, obviously, which is a progressive phenomenon, but also higher frequency of extreme meteorological events, salinization of soils, movements of fish stocks, acidification of coral reefs, and so on. And among the legal questions emerging from that emergency are the consequences also for territorial integrity and sovereignty and statehood continuity, because we know that some of these states could be submerged or we are going to talk a little bit more about that further, could at least become uninhabitable at some point, particularly the atoll nations, which we talk about in the film, and so the states whose territory is entirely composed of low-lying atoll islands, coral islands. Obviously, effects of climate change are not occurring only in the Pacific, and it is a global challenge. However, the singularities of the Pacific that I mentioned justify to dedicate a specific research on them, because the effects of climate change are in this part of the world visible and documented like anywhere else. We know actually that the sea level rise is going further in the Western Pacific than anywhere else in the world. So there's a lot to learn from that experience in terms of new challenges raised, but also in terms of practical and legal measures that have been implemented to deal with the threat and which still need to be implemented. So this is how step by step emerged the idea of the documentary and which aspects could be pinpointed into this film, this audiovisual project. So to tell you everything, the first idea at that point was to go to get some images in Fiji, which is not so far away from New Caledonia, and Fiji has the particularity to have already quite a lot of villages which have been relocated. So we got through the process of permission to get some images over there and to film over there, and then came the pandemic. So at some point we thought we couldn't. It would not be possible to go ahead with the project. I had moved by that time in New Zealand. I was in New Zealand teaching at the University of Waikato, and we started to think about doing it another way. And from that time, began the journey of meeting so many incredible persons. I met different people who were involved in this topic in New Zealand, particularly Kate Brown, who's leading a great organization of networking in the Pacific Islands. And she put me in contact with Lynn and Gloom, who was quite enthusiastic about the project and brought these wonderful images. Because Lynn spent several months in the region, and she could film what we see, particularly at the beginning of the documentary, these atoll islands where it is so obviously visible that sea level rise is threatening the territorial integrity of these islands. The other step, one of the other important step, if I talk about the making of, was to find what we call the narrative line. So when you build a documentary, I learned this speaking with the professionals, you have to get this narrative line to make it visible. And I'm telling you that because it says something about the situation, because the first idea of the narrative line was to be able to meet someone in New Zealand who would have been forced to flee the consequences of climate change and would have to go through the different pathway of migration and facing the difficulties of that pathway. But it appeared that very few people, not to say any, would declare themselves as climate refugee, and I put it between quotation marks, or as a person who would have been forced to flee the consequences of climate change. And this can be explained by different reasons, because it became obvious. We contacted many people and it became obvious that this was not going to be really possible. The first reason is the difficulty for identifying the factors, the causes of the movement induced by the effects of climate change. Because what we can observe is that climate change or the direct consequences of climate change are not directly causing the movement. They are acting more as a catalyzer of existing issues like unemployment, demographic pressure, because even if lots of populations in the Pacific are limited in number, they're not necessarily uniformly spread over the territory. So you can have already a big demographic pressure in some parts of the islands, access to education, etc. So it's the causal chain is always quite difficult to identify. And on that, I would recommend the reading of Maxine Berquet's articles, who appears in the documentary, because she worked quite a lot on this, in interviewing people, and how we need some time and analysis to identify the effects of climate change as the causes of movement. The also explanation for the fact that people would not generally declare themselves as having fled the consequences of climate change is also some rejection of the vulnerability speech that we can find very often. This is also what we can find at the scale of collective actions and governance, and that we try to treat in the film. Because one could think that climate migration is a consensual issue, but I think one of the discovering of the making of the film, making the film, was how sensitive is the question, including politically speaking. There is some will, very understandably, to go over the vulnerability narrative and to focus on recognizing duties of states and efforts that have to be made, including financial efforts, for the communities, for the local communities, to be able to stay on their land. So that's one reason. And the other reason is that all the vocabulary going around climate refugees, or people having been forced to flee the consequences of climate change, is also a vocabulary that can be considered as stigmatizing the people who are living these situations. So the narrative line became different. I wrote the script in another way to make the making of the film possible, and then we could reach all these people, experts, and young leaders from universities, from the CPS, And obviously, I have a lot of anecdotes to tell about all this. I was very touched, and I'm very grateful by how this person gave some time and efforts and trusted me and the team of the film and accepted to participate very kindly and to give a lot of their time. It's a very wonderful experience to see the film projected right now in many parts, having in mind these nice moments I spent with Brianna in Auckland, and with Felipe and Feminata in Auckland too, the family who comes from Tuvalu. And so really all of them gave a lot for the film to exist. We had long hours of rushing, so we had obviously lots of choices to make. But it was each time fascinating to hear these experts and testimonies. And at some point, there was actually a question or we thought, how should I say that? I've been asked if it was possible to give access to the long version of these interviews. It's not easy to do it because it would require a little bit of editing, so it would be a little bit of work. But I think that yes, some of these interviews probably for students or people interested in this issue would be very. It would be interesting to be able to listen to them entirely. So I feel very lucky to have been able to share these moments with all the contributors. So regarding, I don't want to be too long. So regarding what's in the film, as I told you before, it seemed that there was an interest to focus on the situation of the Pacific. And so the film intends to give some general context on the diversity of the region, and including the incredible legal diversity of the Pacific. Actually, the expression of Pacific states and territories usually refers to the islands located in the geographical area also called Oceania. Most of these states and territories are members of the Pacific Islands Forum, the PIF. And however, there is no consensus on the list the expressions refers to. But in its broadest sense, it includes all the PIF members, and it also includes the American territories of Hawaii, Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and the American Samoa, as well as Pitcairn and Wallis and Futuna. So you've been able to see some maps in the movie. There is into these states and countries an incredible diversity of legal situations, to the point that we can clearly refer to Oceania as a legal laboratory. Part of these archipelagos are independent states. Some of them have singular constitutional history. Some are territories of states whose main or whose continental territory is in a different part of the world, and some of these states are also associated states, and even under this expression we have different realities, because the links between Cook Islands with New Zealand, for example, is not the same as the relations between Marshall Islands with United States. So this was an important aspect to mention, because it also says about it says something about the complexity of the migration patterns we can have in the region, and I'll be able to discuss on that point if you have comments to make on this. Regarding also their situation, I think one important aspect is to take into account is the economical situation of those islands. They have to be taken into consideration because they raise a range of difficulties, including the appropriate implementation of mitigation measures, such as infrastructures able of minimizing occasional and permanent flooding. Sea walls, for instance, are very costly to install, and they're not perfect in any case. They also create new problems. Another thing that was shown in the film, or what we tried to show in the film, was the reality of impacts of human rights, because the deterioration of living conditions in the Pacific Islands already caused many persons to move. So one example is the situation of the Carteret Islands, obviously, that we show with the incredible work of Ursula Rakova, and how she planned the relocation of her community. It is also, I think, a very illustrative example of how things are happening when there is no appropriate legal and structural framework for internal relocation, and how these initiatives are carried out by private actors on the land. So Carteret Islands, and I'll be happy also to speak a little bit more about the situation of the Carteret Islands. Also illustrates how a territory becomes uninhabitable before being entirely submerged, because basically it is not possible anymore to grow something on the Carteret Islands. So from my email exchanges and communication with Ursula Rakova, I understood that a few families were still living over there, but she's traveling by boat frequently to bring some food for the few people who are still on the Carteret Islands. One of the other aspects that is treated in Nations of Water is the difficulty of international migration pathways, the inapplicability of the Geneva Convention on the situation of people fleeing the consequences of climate change. And also, as I mentioned just a few minutes before, and that's the Coral Passisi from the CPS who's commenting that how to assess this issue in the Pacific, we need to take into account the great diversity of situations towards migration pathways for the communities, having in mind always that it is always a last resort measure. So in the movie, and as I underlined just before, some territories, sorry, are part of part of territorial states. So there's no legal question about possibility of moving. We have associated territories that are provided with some movement pathways. So for examples, citizens from Cook Islands have the citizenship of New Zealand, so they can move to New Zealand easily. Marshall Islands inhabitants, for instance, would be able to live and work in United States because they are under the Free Association Compact. But all the territories don't have this level of securities. So it is a very important challenge for the region to be able to create more or facilitating secured pathways for these migrations. Apart from the human rights aspects, properly speaking, there are also aspects that are aspects of international law that are directly in connection with the situation of people facing the effects of climate change in the region. There is the big questions of the continuity of statehood in the case that one of the constituent elements of statehood would be missing, namely territory or even before population, if the entire population of these countries, specifically atoll low-lying nations, would have to move. Is the question of the maintenance of maritime spaces is also raised. Could we have, in the case of the submersion of the entire territory of a state, could we maintain the rights on the maritime spaces? So that is another very important point that is which is raised in the great report made by the in the Commission of International Law, in the second report from the group dedicated to the silver rise issue. This is specifically a very important issue, again, in the Pacific, because of the geographical situations of these islands. The proportion between land territory and maritime spaces is unique. The ratio is unique. To give an illustration, to value EEZ, to value exclusive economic zone, is 27,000 times the land territory, the superficie of the land territory. And this is also a resource, an economical resource, very substantial for most of these countries and territories. So all these aspects that are raised in the film, obviously, I mean, I would be happy to discuss with you on these different aspects. A few words on what it is not in the film, because a lot of other things could have been put into Nations of Waters. Details about factors and causes of displacement. So we didn't have time to give some details about these effects, otherwise we wouldn't have enough time to treat the legal aspects. But I think there's a lot to say about that. I talked about salinization of soils. I talked about high tides, erosion. Acidification of corals, of coral reefs, for instance, is something that we didn't have time to explain in the final version of the film. But in her interview, Coral Passisi, in the initial version of the interview, she speaks quite substantively about that. And that's very interesting, because she was explaining how acidification of coral reefs means deprivation of proteins for the communities, because lots of the marine life is concentrated around the coral reefs. And so when they disappear, this stock of fresh proteins disappear too, with no real alternative. Regarding frequency of extreme meteorological events, Brianna, for instance, in the initial version of her interview, gave the illustration that at her age, she already experienced something like, I don't remember the exact number, but 8 or 9 big range cyclones, while her mother at the same age would have experienced maybe only 2 or 3. So there is the risk for extreme meteorological events is extremely high for a lot of these territories. Other places also could have been illustrated in the film, and unfortunately we couldn't get images and testimonies from all of them, but I would have loved to show more about Vanuatu, for instance, which is a place that I had the chance to go 3 times, and I really love. And it's really appealing when you go to Paul Villa to see the shipwrecks from the cyclone palm that are still visible in the main island, and where in the main island some villages already also, had to be relocated. We could have talked about Tonga, we could have talked about Guam, etc. Another point that is very important at the time of assessing human rights, climate change, and climate-induced relocations is finance. So that's something we could not treat extensively in the documentary, because it requires to give a lot of details. And some of the contributors actually spoke about these issues in their interviews, because obviously it's crucial to be able to give appropriate framework and structure for the relocations. There are also legal instruments that we could not mention, or we just mentioned briefly, that are also very important at the time of assessing this issue. And to that regard, I just draw your attention on the fact that there is a website dedicated to Nations of Water, nationsofwater.unc.nc. Very easy, and you have a list of resources on the website to be able to go further and to have some readings around this issue. So finally, where are we now? Lots of things could drive us to pessimism regarding fight against climate change and what is at stake. But we also witness incredible evolutions. And they remind that law cannot all, for sure, but it is still a very powerful level for change. Jane McAdam mentioned it in the film. So many things have been done to raise awareness, and we can see some changes. We can see initiatives to give better framework for climate displacement. I can mention very quickly the Global Compact for Migration, the Nansen Initiative that gave rise to the Platform for Disaster Displacement, the Sydney Declaration of Principles on the Protection of Persons Displaced in the context of sea level rise in 2018. Which is very interesting because it insists also on the necessity to respect the will of the communities concerned. The climate mobility framework in the Pacific is also something which is in process. There is a solidarity in the Pacific And we have to underline also the great work of the CPS and obviously the PIF for the political cooperation. There was also very recently a climate migration council to raise awareness that was created with a very wide range of different actors, academics, former presidents, and yeah, lots of, and representatives of international organizations, lots of different people. It is also very important to mention the recent creation of the mandate of a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, and the recent creation of a loss and damages fund, which is not dotted yet, but now at least legally exists. Some reflections are also conducted at the highest level, including by the Commission of International Law. Evolution also, of course, of case law. We saw recently the decision taken by the Human Rights Committee on the Torres Strait Islanders. And also future actions, the ICG campaign led by Vanuatu to have an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Maybe also some initiative taken by the Commission of Small Island States and Climate Change and International Law that was created recently by Tuvalu and Antigua and Barbuda. So, and also, sorry, I'm seeing that I'm running out of time. I want to let time for a question. And also, you might have seen the recent declaration of Tuvalu and of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who declared the project, who informed about the project of the country to upload itself entirely in the metaverse. And a website was created already with the reproduction of one of the islands of Tuvalu. So we can also talk about what are the perspectives of what is the role of digital existence of states in the continuity of statehood in case of disappearance of one of the elements of statehood. So yeah, to conclude, thank you. I've been a little bit too long probably. The issue of climate-induced migrations and more generally human rights and climate change raises, I think, much wider question about the evolution of territoriality, and also about the making of law, the adaptation of law, and the role of law, as we can say that we could not have direct binding instruments to deal with the issue, but finally all this conjunction of soft law initiatives are not perfect for sure, but they allowed to raise definitely more awareness and to provide more security for people concerned by the effects or facing the effects of climate change, particularly in such areas as the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine, for this really fascinating explanation about, I mean, not only the making of the film, of the documentary, but also linking it to not only how international law has been identified as a key issue in order to better prepare for climate change, not only in terms of the framework of the Paris Agreement, but also in the specific cases of dealing with consequences of the adverse impacts of climate change, like sea level rise. But also, I think what is really, and that's what we wanted to try to discuss, is how tools such as documentaries can help also in highlighting the issues, in a way also trying to explain them in more simplified terms. But also, I think you said that in the beginning, to show the realities. I think, you know, when you're discussing, and I see that also in our work in the ILC, I mean, when we are discussing about, you know, the impact of sea level rise in affected populations, I think the discourse really changes and the discussion really changes when people see the situation in the ground, and then they really see the impact that has. And so it's making it more concrete. We're not just talking about abstract things, but we're making it more concrete. So this has really been a fascinating example of how to use other tools, such as, you know, documentaries, and also you mentioned at the end the initiative of Vanuatu for an ICJ advisory opinion, which I can share with participants that the text of the resolution will be very soon shared with the wider membership in the General Assembly. So the question will become, you know, the public domain. But that also started with a public advocacy campaign by students in the Pacific, and so it's very interesting how, you know, how we also use other tools to not only, you know, promote the development of the law, to raise awareness, and certainly documentaries, you know, public advocacy campaigns by youth, very strong on social media, have been key instruments in the overall legal discussion of this issue, you know, much more than what we see in other areas of international law. So I think this is also something new that we were watching. So without wanting to take more time, I wanted to open the floor for our participants to ask Professor Giraudeau any questions you may have, not only about what she has just told you, which is very interesting as background to the documentary, but maybe also some questions that you may have had from watching the film. So I open the floor. Feel free to raise your hand to ask a live question or to type something in the chat that I am monitoring.
So maybe meanwhile, I can add to what you said, Patricia, that, yeah, the initiative from Vanuatu comes from a group of students, and I had the chance to have several discussions with them and with one of their leaders, Solomon Yao. And yeah, I think I've been so fascinated by the energy of all these young leaders and students from the Pacific who wanted to use law as a change, as a game changer. And so, yeah, it's I think it's a very positive, hopeful example.
Yes, indeed, it's really a grassroots movement, and then makes its way up, and then the government takes it up, and then the negotiations within the UN started after consultations with the other Pacific islands, and so it's really interesting also as a process. You know,
Yeah,
how do you make
totally.
something? Yeah. So we have a question from Anastasia Stacey Fraser from New Zealand. Please.
Hi, thank you. That was
Hi.
fascinating. I like particularly the last discussion talking about, I guess, that progression from advocacy to increasing awareness using new tools, and then building, I guess, to the soft law you touched on. And one of the questions I had, I think, if I remember correctly, one of the things the Pacific Island Forum did was a declaration around sea level change, and I guess setting out their view on what maritime zones or what should happen to maritime zones. With those kind of soft law, that kind of declaration, do you see those as being effective? Is that, I guess, part of getting awareness at an international level about starting to put a line in the sand about where countries want to see international law going, and to harden maybe down the line a little bit, like what we're seeing with Vanuatu, sort of moving things through the ICJ? Or is, I guess, do you see those as useful, those kind of declarations, and part of the pathway, I guess, to affect change or use law as a tool?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is. And it's also actually a very interesting example, an illustration of process, and to regarding the example you mentioned, to the process of crystallization of customary rule, because the declaration you mentioned from August 2021 is the first one entirely dedicated to the issue of maintenance and permanence of maritime limits and boundaries, but there were also all of a set of declarations from the PIF and all the other cooperation structures in the Pacific. And so it was indeed taken into account by different reports by the International Law Association and the Commission of International Law, but maybe Patricia will want to add something. And to use these examples, not the one of August 2021, because it's too recent, but already the former declarations, to use them as illustration of state practice. So actually we could discuss that. Maybe it is more illustration of willingness from the states than practice, but it was considered as being illustration of a regional practice. So we have, and the Commission goes further, because the authors of the reports says that it's we can see, or it could lead with more elements to the recognition of a customary rule. So that could lead, finally, we're not at that point yet, but that could lead finally to recognition of permanence of limits, maritime and boundaries as a customary rule. And it has already some effects, because it already fixes the aspects of for cooperation between the Pacific states. So if they don't challenge, even if it's not a binding instrument, if they don't challenge the boundaries between themselves, it's the first step for the maritime zones to be maintained as such. I think now, if we speak about territories that would be entirely submerged, then we go to another level, because then we would have to inverse the principles that lands, how do you say that in English? That lands...
Land dominates the sea.
That's it. Thank you, Patricia. Yeah. So yeah. So in case of total disappearance, I think we go to another level, because this principle would be reversed at some point, or at least would be different. I don't know if I answer okay with your questions, or if Patricia wants to add something, because she's the expert in.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll add something. Well, the real expert on this issue about the law of the sea is Nilufer Oral, who's not with us today. She's the one who's been leading together with our colleague Bogdan Orescu on the law of the sea issues, and I'm leading on the protection of persons part, and my other colleague Juan Jose on statehood. But it's actually a very interesting point that you raise, Anastasia. It's you know, this has been a fascinating, and it will continue to be process in terms of, you know, lawmaking, and how this interacts, not only, you know, how states are trying to shape the law through taking up their issues in declarations like the one that you mentioned, the Declaration on the Preservation of the Maritime Zones from 2021 by PIF. But also all those different aspects that we were discussing about public advocacy, using new tools. But I think there is an important discussion, and it's not yet absolutely clear. I mean, I agree in general with what Geraldine said, but we've been discussing now how to assess this type of declarations. What are they exactly? Is it state practice? Is it something that is more than practice and is already moving towards the creation of regional custom? And I'm not sure the ingredients are there. Is it, for example, and I think now the PIF are arguing in that sense that it's that declaration represents their interpretation of UNCLOS, of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that the UNCLOS allows for the interpretation that is contained in the declaration in terms of depositing the charts of the situation as it is now, and saying that, regardless what happens in the future in terms of sea level rise that is caused by climate change, then there's no need to update those charts. So it's quite technical. It's a difficult question because it's quite technical, but we're having this discussion, exactly what this declarations are supposed to mean from the legal point of view. But it's also very interesting that this declaration by the PIF has also already been endorsed by AOSIS, which is a larger group also with states in the Caribbean, for example, and the African, Caribbean and Pacific organization, the ACP. So we are seeing really, in the absence of a multilateral process to deal comprehensively with these questions, that, there are little steps being taken and they have an impact. We are still discussing exactly in technical terms what that impact is, if we are really looking at interpretation, formation of customary international law. But in the end, I think we'll have to come to some kind of an understanding of what this means. But I don't want to, it's hard for me to keep away from the discussion because I'm, as I said, interested in these issues. But perhaps we have time for another question. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So maybe one more question from our participants. I'm trying to see the chat. No. Well, I don't seem to see any more questions. So with that, I think we can wrap up, and please join me with our virtual applause in thanking Professor Giraudeau for coming and explaining us the making the making of the film, but that really touches on important issues and that allows us to also discuss these issues from the international law point of view. It's probably really a unique experience where you've gathered so many legal experts, trying to explain and in a way that it's accessible to the general public, the complex legal issues and the differences of approach. And this has been really something probably different than what we have in the eAcademy, which is a more typical, formalistic legal approach. But I think this is also an important area of international law where things are happening in slightly different ways, and these aspects are extremely fascinating in terms of the process. So thank you so much, Geraldine. We were delighted to have you. Thank you for taking the time and for sharing with us. We hope that the public that is out there is now not only the participants, but the rest of those that are able to see this recording would be curious and go on YouTube and search Nations of Water and watch this extraordinary documentary. So we'll come back tomorrow for the second part of the lecture on climate change with Professor Christina Voigt. We will proceed the next 2 weeks with the topics of human rights and international humanitarian law. And of course, keep an eye for our initiatives with special lectures, because climate change and international law and climate change and human rights is certainly an area of interest for the Center for International Law. And we are trying to put together more initiatives in this area. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia.
And
bye.